My dearest viewers, today I am going to tell you a beautiful story of a princess who sacrificed herself for her kingdom. Elsa sacrificed herself to save the kingdom, and Anna brought Elsa back from ice. But the price she paid will break your heart. Story unfolds like this. Winter did not arrive in Arendelle with a gentle dusting of snow. It struck like a suffocating shroud. By the third week of this harsh, unnatural frost, the harbor was locked in thick, uneven ice. The water stopped moving entirely, held fast in a grip that defied the tides. Ships sat frozen in place, their hulls groaning under the immense pressure of the expanding ice. The wood cracked and popped, a rhythmic, violent sound that echoed through the empty docks. Every rope, every mast, every plank was coated in a layer of gray, breakable snow. The air itself felt heavy, thick with a cold that bit through stone and steel alike. No birds sang, no bells rang. The city stood silent, buried in a landscape that had turned to glass. Down at the waterline, the ice continued to thicken, creeping up the sides of the stone harbors. It seems that the harbor became a graveyard of trapped vessels, held in a permanent ice. Elsa stood on the balcony, her gaze fixed on the rooftops. Shadows were moving across the slate tiles, but they were not cast by clouds. They were creatures made of black ice, skittering like ink dropped into a basin of water. Wherever they touched, the stone turned breakable and gray, crystallizing into spikes, unnatural pieces. She watched one creature pause, its limbs pulsing with a rhythmic, dark light, before it shattered a chimney stack with a flick of its claw. Elsa pressed her palms against the stone railing, reaching out to freeze the corruption in its tracks. She pushed her will into the air, but her magic felt slow, thick, and unresponsive. A superior, harmful cold pushed back, wrapping around her fingers. The frost on the railing was not hers. It was a parasitic growth, feeding on the city. She looked past the rooftops, tracing the source of the chill to the North Mountain. A rhythmic, pulsing vibration shook the ground beneath her feet every few minutes. A heartbeat of ice that dwarfed her own. The heavy oak door groaned as it swung open, revealing Anna. Her boots crunched rhythmically against the frost-covered floor, each step a sharp sound in the cruel silence of the room. She moved toward the center of the chamber, her breath visible in the air. She held a lit lantern, its flame flickering violently against the encroaching chill that seeped through the walls. She stopped a few paces from the balcony. Her expression tight, she said in her steady voice,
"The scouts did not return?"
She set the lantern down on a side table, the metal ringing against the stone.
"They reached the base of the North Mountain, but the trail went cold."
Elsa turned away from the balcony, her eyes meeting Anna's. The weight of the kingdom rested in the silence between them. Anna reached into her pack and pulled out a heavy fur cloak, tossing it toward her sister, and stated,
"We leave at dawn."
Elsa caught the cloak, the fabric thick and grounding. They both looked toward the distant, jagged peak, acknowledging the danger. The ascent began in a world stripped of color. Within an hour, the horizon vanished, swallowed by a blinding whiteout that erased the path beneath their boots. Each step fought the slope. Icy winds bit skin. Elsa braved the storm. Anna trailed, clutching her pack. Fierce gust ripped air, forcing them to knees down. The visibility becomes zero. For a terrifying moment, the sound of the storm wiped out everything, and Elsa reached out, her fingers clawing at the freezing air until they locked onto Anna's wrist. They pulled themselves together, huddled against a rock face to catch their breath. The air here was thin, sharp as needles in their chests, breathing glass, lungs silent, muscles burned, their legs heavy with the weight of the climb. They were no longer climbing a trail, but fighting a vertical frozen void. The final peak gave way to a plateau of rough, unnatural rock. At its center stood a pillar of rock, shiny and black against the swirling snow. A vortex of shadows coiled around the pillar, moving with a fluid, predatory grace that defied the wind. Elsa stopped, her boots sliding on the slick surface as the ground beneath them pulsed with a rhythmic, subterranean thrum. This was not a weather pattern, it was a heartbeat. The air inside the vortex was thick, vibrating with a low, grinding sound like glaciers shifting against stone. A voice emerged from the center of the dark mass, booming and hollow, echoing through the thin air.
Only the spirit of winter can contain me.
The shadows lashed out, striking the mountain rock with enough force to send boulders tumbling into the abyss. Elsa watched as the stone shattered into gray dust upon contact. The vortex expanded, its edges blurring into the sky, revealing a hunger that consumed everything it touched. The sisters stood paralyzed as the shadows surged toward them, testing the air, sensing their warmth. The living hunger had finally found its prey. The camp was a graveyard of silence. Anna slept, her breathing shallow and ragged, while Elsa sat by the dying embers of their fire. She held her hands out, watching the frost patterns crawl across her skin like living lace. They were not the delicate, crystalline structures of her past, but jagged, aggressive lines that pulsed in time with the mountain's heartbeat. She stood up and walked to the edge of the cliff. Below, the vortex churned, a swirling abyss of shadow that hungered for the warmth of the world. She reached out, extending a fingertip toward the dark mass. The shadows recoiled, then surged forward, wrapping around her frost-covered fingers with a familiar, biting cold. She pulled back, her skin glowing with a faint, pale light. The realization settled in her chest, heavy and absolute. The storm was not an external force to be defeated, but a void that required a vessel. Only a spirit of winter possessed the density to anchor such a hunger. She looked back at the tent where Anna lay, then turned to face the abyss. The choice was made. There would be no return from the center of the storm. Elsa stepped off the ledge, her boots leaving the solid ground for the swirling chaos of the vortex. She did not fall. The air itself turned thick and viscous, supporting her weight as she drifted toward the center. The shadows sensed her. They lashed out, thin tendrils of void striking her shoulders and waist, tightening into rigid, freezing bands. She felt the impact in her marrow, a crushing pressure that threatened to snap her resolve. She did not fight. Instead, she exhaled, releasing the barrier she had maintained her entire life. She opened her core, inviting the hunger in. The shadow chains surged, thickening into heavy, iron-like coils that pinned her arms to her sides. They bit into her skin, leaving dark, bruised marks that pulsed with the mountain's rhythm. She gasped as the cold flooded her veins, a freezing tide. It was a violent intrusion, a searing invasion of her very essence. She became the anchor, binding the hungry storm to her own heartbeat. The final surge of darkness slammed into her, a tidal wave of void that threatened to shatter her spirit. Elsa held her breath, her eyes wide, as the last of the shadows poured into her core. The mountain groaned, a deep tectonic rumble. Then, the pressure peaked. A blinding, white-hot flash erupted from her chest, tearing through the swirling vortex. The light did not burn. It froze. It raced outward, turning the chaotic shadows into solid, unbreakable glass. The air solidified. The wind died in a single, sharp instant. Elsa's body stiffened, her skin hardening into translucent, unyielding crystal. Her hand remained outstretched, fingers splayed, as if reaching for a final anchor. the mountain peak transformed into a jagged monument of ice. Below, the storm vanished, leaving only a hollow, ringing silence. The obsidian spire was gone, replaced by a crystalline statue. The world below stopped shaking. The air grew still. The eternal winter had found its cage, and the queen had become the lock. The climb became easier as the air cleared, though the path remained treacherous underfoot. Anna dragged herself over the final narrow peak, her breath coming in uneven, shallow gasps. She expected the roar of the storm. She expected the biting lash of the wind. Instead, she found a silence so profound it felt heavy. The sky above had cracked open, revealing a pale, uncaring sun that cast long, sharp shadows across the peak. Anna stood, her legs trembling from the exertion, and scanned the summit. The black peak was gone. In its place stood a figure of translucent, shimmering ice. She stepped forward, her boots crunching against the frost-covered rock. She stopped 10 steps away. It was Elsa. The queen stood at the very edge of the precipice, her hand still reaching out into the empty air. Her skin was a pale, polished surface. Anna moved closer, her fingers hovering inches from the cold, unyielding surface. She looked at Elsa's face. The eyes were closed. Anna returned to the castle. It felt cave, a hollow shell echoing with the sound of Anna's solitary footsteps. She bypassed the throne room, heading straight for the basement levels where the air grew thick with the scent of damp parchment and decaying leather. The archives were a labyrinth of towering shelves. Anna pulled a heavy, iron-bound door open, the hinges screaming in the quiet. She began with the most recent records, tossing aside ledgers and tax reports until the floor was buried under a drift of paper. Her hands were stained with black ink and gray dust. She moved to the older sections where the books were bound in cracked, brittle materials. She spent hours in the dim light of a single, flickering candle, her eyes scanning line after line of archaic script. She pushed aside a stack of heavy, dust-covered tomes, the impact sending a cloud of grit into the still air. She did not cough. She did not stop. She pulled a ladder across the stone floor, the metal wheels grinding against the grit, and climbed to the highest, darkest shelf. The binding was rough, smelling of ancient smoke and something metallic. Anna worked the leather ties loose, her fingernails scraping against the stiff material. Inside, the scroll was a single, continuous strip of piece of paper made of calfskin, covered in spiky, ink-stained runes that seemed to shift under the candlelight. She pulled a brass magnifying lens from her pocket, pressing it against the surface. The light distorted, turning the characters into long, dark needles. She followed the lines with her index finger, her breath hitching as the meaning began to unite. The language was archaic, a dialect of the mountain tribes. She traced a warning, etched in deep, crimson ink. It spoke of a balance that could not be cheated. To awaken a soul locked in eternal ice, the petitioner had to offer an equivalent anchor. Anna read the passage 3 times, the words burning into her mind. The final line was blunt, stripped of all metaphor. She stared at the sentence until the ink blurred. To awaken a frozen soul, one must give up what they love most. She rolled the piece of paper tight, the sound echoing like a snap of bone. She stood up, her joints stiff, and tucked the scroll into her belt. The price was absolute. The moon hung full and bloated over the peaks, casting a sickly silver light across the valley. Anna stepped out of the castle gates, the iron bars clanging shut behind her with a final, hollow ring. She did not look back. The path to the North Mountain was a spiky scar against the snow, buried under layers of fresh, frozen powder. She moved with a steady, mechanical pace, her breath blooming in the air like ghosts. The wind picked up as she ascended, whipping shards of ice against her face. But she leaned into the storm, her muscles burning with the effort. She reached the timberline where the trees stood like skeletal gods. A sudden, violent gust knocked her to her knees. She pushed herself upright, her grip tightening on the scroll tucked beneath her belt. The summit loomed ahead. When she crested the peak, the wind died instantly. There, in the center of the plateau, stood the statue. She had come to pay the price. The statue was colder than the surrounding air, a dense, biting chill that seeped through her skin the moment she made contact. Anna pressed both palms against the smooth, unyielding surface of the ice. She felt nothing of the person beneath, only the absolute stillness of a trapped winter. She took a breath, the air sharp and thin, and began the chant. The words were heavy, clicking and sliding against her teeth like stones in a riverbed. At first, her voice was a thin, trembling thread against the vast silence of the peak. She stumbled on a syllable, the sound dying in the wind, and she had to steady herself, digging her heels into the rock. She started again, louder this time, forcing the ancient rhythm from her throat. As the final vowel of the first stanza left her lips, a pulse of pressure built behind her ribs. A golden light, hot and violent, erupted from the center of her chest. It was not a soft glow. It was a searing, radiant force that pushed against the freezing air. The light bled into her arms, turning the veins in her hands into glowing golden filaments. It flowed forward, seeping into the statue, turning the gray ice translucent. The mountain shuddered. The light intensified, casting long, flickering shadows against the obsidian spire. The golden light did not just flow, it pulled. Anna felt a hollow ache widen in her chest as the magic demanded its payment. Behind her eyes, the world began to flicker. She saw the courtyard of their youth, the bright sun reflecting off fresh powder, and the two of them shaping snow into small, rounded figures. She reached out in her mind to touch the cold, packed snow of a snowman, but the image blurred. The laughter that had echoed in her memory for years turned into a low, distorted hum. She watched, helpless, as the scene dissolved into a swirling gray mist that drifted away into the freezing air. Another memory surfaced, the sound of a soft voice singing in the dark, and it too frayed at the edges, thinning until it was nothing more than static. Anna gasped, her knees buckling as the golden current drained the warmth from her thoughts. She tried to anchor herself to the feeling of her sister's hand, but the sensation slipped through her fingers like dry sand. The mountain peak seemed to tilt. Her mind felt like a library being emptied, shelf by shelf, into the void. The final threads of her identity were pulled into the light. A final, sharp crack fractured the silence of the summit. It began at the base of the statue, a hairline crack that raced upward with blinding speed. The sound was not the dull thud of stone breaking, but a high echo's chime, like 1,000 silver bells ringing in unison against the wind. The golden light trapped within the ice flared one last time, turning the statue into a beacon that blinded the eyes. Then, the structure gave way. Shards of crystallized ice exploded outward, showering the rocky ground in a glittering, lethal rain. The pressure that had held the peak in a suffocating grip vanished in a single heartbeat. Elsa fell forward, her body no longer anchored to the stone. She hit the ground with a heavy, sudden impact, her chest heaving as she pulled in her first lungful of air. The frost that had encased her limbs shattered into fine powder, leaving her skin pale and trembling. She collapsed against Anna, her weight dead and heavy, her eyes snapping open to the harsh light of the mountain. She gasped, a spiky rhythmic sound that tore through the quiet, her fingers clawing at the air as she struggled to find her footing. The storm had stopped. The air on the peak was still. Elsa pushed herself up, her hands trembling against the cold, spiky rock. She looked down at Anna, her chest tight, with the sudden, overwhelming relief of seeing her sister alive. She reached out, her fingers brushing Anna's cheek, searching for the warmth of a shared history, a flicker of the bond that had defined their lives. She waited for the recognition, for the familiar spark of affection that had always bridged the distance between them. But as their eyes locked, the air between them grew heavy and still. Anna did not lean into the touch. She did not smile. She simply stared, her gaze clear and steady, but entirely devoid of the depth Elsa had known. Elsa's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, uneven rhythm. She tried to form a name, but the sound caught in her throat. Anna pulled back, breaking the contact. Her voice was soft, calm, and utterly devastating. She asked,
"Who are you?"
Days bled into a rhythm of quiet, agonizing routine within the castle walls. The winter had retreated, leaving the gardens to emerge from the thaw in shades of muted green and damp earth. Soft, rhythmic flakes of snow still drifted from the sky, dusting the stone paths in a thin, white veil. Anna stood by the edge of the fountain, her gaze fixed on a cluster of birds hopping along the rim. She did not notice the heavy silence of the courtyard, nor did she look toward the balcony where Elsa stood watching her. Elsa descended the stairs, her boots making no sound on the frost-dampened grass. She stopped a few steps away, her hands clasped tightly behind her back to keep them from shaking. Anna turned, her movements fluid and graceful, but her face held only the polite, distant smile one offers a passing acquaintance. She tilted her head, observing Elsa with a calm, analytical interest that lacked any trace of shared history. Anna said, her voice light and devoid of the urgency that had.
"You are very kind to stay. I feel like I should know you, but the name just will not come."
Elsa stood frozen, the ache in her chest a dull, constant weight that no amount of spring air could lift. She reached out, her hand hovering in the space between them, but she pulled it back before the distance could be bridged. They were two strangers sharing a garden, bound by a history that only one of them could remember. Elsa watched the water ripple in the fountain, the sound steady and indifferent. She knew the cost of the magic that had saved her, yet the silence between them was a burden she could not set down. She stepped closer, her shadow lengthening across the basin. Anna did not retreat. She stood perfectly still, her eyes tracking the movement of the water, her expression open and unburdened by the weight of the past. Elsa held her breath, the air sharp and clean in her lungs. She extended her hand, fingers trembling slightly as they hovered just inches from Anna's own. It was a gamble against the void. She reached out, letting her fingertips graze the back of Anna's hand. The contact was brief, a mere whisper of skin against skin. At that exact moment, a subtle shift occurred. Deep within Anna's chest, a point of warmth ignited. It was not a memory, not yet, but a golden spark that pulsed against the hollow space where her history used to reside. It flickered, bright and defiant, casting a faint inner light that made Anna's breath hitch. She pulled her hand back, not in fear, but in sudden, sharp confusion. She looked at her own palm, then back at Elsa, her brow furrowing as if trying to catch a scent on the wind. The golden light faded, leaving behind a lingering warmth that Anna could not name. She stood motionless, her hand still tingling where the contact had occurred. Elsa saw the question forming in her sister's eyes, a flicker of recognition struggling against the void. She could have spoken, she could have told her everything. Instead, she stayed silent. She knew that forcing the memory would only shatter the fragile growth. Elsa stepped back, giving Anna the space to breathe. The snow continued to fall, coating the garden in a soft, white silence. Elsa watched the flakes land on Anna's shoulders, a gentle reminder of the world they had once built together. She did not reach out again. She simply stood, a symbol of patience in the quiet garden. She would wait as long as the winter lasted. The past was gone, but the future was a blank page, and for the first time in months, the air felt less like a shroud and more like a promise.